Okay, my privilege to introduce this last session. I'll just mention a sentence about each person. In the center here, Raghu Karnad, who has had a couple session already today, but Raghu is one of the books of the year, I think, and it's a book that's destined to last for a very long time. A most wonderful book about Indians in World War II. I urge you to buy it. It's The Father's Field. It's available outside. And Vedica Kant has also written a most wonderful book this year, released earlier this year, about Indians in World War I, with a foreword by Amitav Ghosh, who spent so much time here in Goa. That book is also available outside. These are two extremely valuable contributions, because all of you, like myself, who was force-fed the story of the world wars, have learned a particular set of have been force-fed a particular kind of set of blinkers. And what both Raghu and Vedica do is open up an entirely new kind of vista, a new way of looking at the war. And in both cases, they're writing about Indians, but they're also, in a way, expanding our understanding of the war. So that's been a very valuable contribution. Very proud to have them both with us. We also have a new resident of Goa, Yudhisthir Isar. I'm very pleased that he's on this panel. And his book is Chronicles of Time and Chance. It's a collection of writings by his father, Raymond Francis Isar. And this is also a most fascinating hidden history, because he brings in a whole set of stories and narratives and it's a way of understanding India, or what happened to India at a particular set of time, through a unique set of perspectives. And I'm very pleased that we have the opportunity. I had the privilege of reading the book earlier this year. I think it's a great contribution. I noticed it fit really well in Ram Guha's hand. It seemed very suited to him, and he in fact spoke about the cover immediately. So I think it's a valuable book, and privileged to have it. It's on sale here as well, and you can talk about it. And finally, Reena Martins. Now, Reena Martins' book we wanted to showcase last year. It's the most delightful book it's called Bomoi Kar. It's a collection of stories and hidden histories, really, about Goans in Bombay. And it's a very charming and delightful book. I enjoyed it very much. I had the chance to review it a little bit in Mint, and I urge you all to pick it up. It's a must-have, and Christmas season's right around the corner, so I urge you to go get it. So without further ado, over to Reena.
Hi everybody, and thanks for taking the time to come. I'm sure many of you have been sleepy after the tasty chicken curry and rice. I certainly am. Talking about food and hidden histories, the two seem to go together, at least for me, because I spent a lot of time chasing food memories for my book, and one of the most precious nuggets I found on food, that is Goan bakeries, was while running around in circles for a plate of biryani, looking for this biryani joint. So it really resonates well with what our writers here have also been working on. Okay, this is not about me, this is about them. So my first question would go to Vedica. In your book, If I Die Here, Who Will Remember Me?, where you talk about Indian soldiers who fought in the Middle East in the First World War. There's this conversation between a stretcher bearer for the Bengal Ambulance Corps and an Indian soldier, where the stretcher bearer asks the Indian soldier, "What are you going to gain from this war? Why are you cutting each other's throats? You live in Hindustan, we in Turkey. Neither of us have met." Would you imagine this conversation being played out in the present day between, let's say, an American soldier and an ISIS soldier or a Taliban soldier?
No. Can you all hear me? Well, I think in the example of an American soldier and very close. Okay. Now? In the case of In the case of an American soldier and an ISIS soldier, they at least know what they are really fighting for. They represent, or at least are fighting a war on behalf of an ideology or a country. My book was about Indian soldiers who fought in the First World War, and what really attracted me to that story was that when you read about the First World War, it still is largely remembered as a war between European countries and between Europeans. I was quite surprised when I first stumbled across the topic to realize that 1.5 million Indians had fought in that war, and they'd fought across all theatres, whether it was the Western Front, the Middle East, or East Africa. And I was really quite interested in finding out more about what their motivations were, because I think when you talk about an American soldier, there is an identity and a link to the country they're fighting for, whereas an Indian soldier at that time was not fighting on behalf of India, he was fighting on behalf of the British Empire. It was the British Indian Army. So I was more interested in kind of unraveling what those motivations were, and also kind of unraveling what that experience of fighting was, because they ended up fighting different enemies. What was it like for an Indian to fight a German? What was it like for an Indian to fight a Turk, especially at a time when the majority of soldiers in the Indian army were Muslim? And the Caliph, the Ottoman Sultan was the Caliph of the Islamic world at the time, someone to whom, most Indian Muslims professed allegiance. So it was those kind of complicated questions of loyalty, of belonging, of being in a colonial environment, and the complications that opened up, that kind of made me interested in the subject and writing that book. I think when we think of colonial history, we tend to make it very cut and dry, this was good, this was bad, but in actual fact it was much more complicated than that. And that's something that I found quite fascinating.
In an English cemetery in Istanbul, you talk about seeing this grave of Lance Naik Dan Bahadur Limu, 5th Gurkha Regiment, died on 30th March 1919. And it also says, the gravestone also says, the following Hindu soldier of the Indian Army is honored here. Now, did you also see graves of Muslim soldiers, and was the religion mentioned?
Yeah, so it's true, you will come across colonial era cemeteries even in India, but World War cemeteries kind of dot the world quite literally, and especially cemeteries maintained by what is now the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. They are beautifully maintained, really garden-like in how pristine they are, and quite shocking to go to a place of such destruction and death almost and be struck by the beauty of those places. But one of the things the British were quite good at doing, and you talked about food, and I'll come to that in a minute because that's quite a central part of my story as well, was maintaining those religious lines very, very assiduously, whether it was, they were very, very scarred by 1857 and the idea that, you might have religious, issues of religion flaring up into rebellion. So they were very, very keen to ensure that, dietary laws and dietary restrictions were very closely followed. Proper, whether it was a cremation or burial, all of those traditions were properly followed for all the soldiers according to their religion, their caste, etc. So whether it's having halal meat, non-halal meat, whether it's having a proper cremation ceremony, whether it's having an army that's traveling with imams and priests and the right kinds of cooks, all according to caste. They were very, very good at doing that. So when you go to a cemetery, you will have on each tombstone, quite often, we think it's an individual body buried under the tombstone, but these are quite often just ceremonial stones of remembrance, and they will have either an Om, which symbolizes that it's a Hindu soldier, or a cross that symbolizes that it's a Christian soldier. So for each religion, you will have an engraving in Urdu, for example, if it's a Muslim soldier. So those religious lines are maintained even in death very strongly.
Okay, we go to Raghu. Raghu, in your book, Farthest Field, where you trace the steps of the Indian soldiers in the Second World War through your family. And if you can remind me of the names. Sorry, I've forgotten the names of your family.
The main protagonist, his name is Bobby, and his sister Nugs, and her husband, and another sister and another husband.
That's right. What helped you more with this book? Was it, you've been quoted somewhere as saying that you're a nice South Indian blend. Am I quoting you right?
Yeah.
Did your ancestry help you more, or was it the fact that you're a journalist and used to collecting information?
Well, it puts you in an interesting position to be a nice South Indian blend and find yourself writing a military history, or what do you say? A military history, or at least a story set during a war, because if you grow up in most parts of South India, you don't consider yourself as having a military legacy whatsoever, nor living in a geography that has much of a military record or a military past. And by military past, I mean a past involving a war, at least in previous centuries. I mean, if you consider the city of Madras, which is where my characters grow up, and they grow up in Calicut, and then they all end up in the city of Madras in college. And all the time that I had spent in my grandmother's house in the city of Madras, I had never imagined that it had anything like a graze with a world war, because you think the last time that Madras was up in arms was when the British took it. But as it turns out, that's not the case at all, and Madras has as dramatic an encounter with the Second World War as you can have, short of actually being bombed or invaded. So this South Indian blend, this is complicated.
Sounds delicious, kind of.
The South Indian blend, which involves mainly that half of my family being Parsis from Calicut, who then grow up in Tamil Nadu, provided a very nice sort of unlikely angle of entry into this history. And that's valuable for a couple of reasons. When I've talked about this book, a lot of people ask me, isn't it a little bit of an inappropriate, maybe slightly elitist viewpoint from which to look at the war, that of Parsis and that of middle-class young men and women from South India, as opposed to the relatively larger, in fact relatively much larger numbers of men from the northwest and the north who populated the ranks. And my line of thinking about that is actually that the war in which the experience of the man of the ranks, or the Jawan, is sort of iconic, is probably Vedica's words, First World War, because they were in fact the entirety of all Indians who served in the army in the First World War, barring very few in very select positions and corps, were in the ranks. A minuscule number of Indians were able to hold anything like a rank of command at all. What happens in the Second World War, which is one of the things that's profoundly interesting and kind of transformative for the country and for the army and for the war, is that under the pressure of the war effort and the requirement to expand the army so dramatically, it rose more than 10 times in a few years, to more than 10 times its size. For the first time, the British government has to permit the induction of large numbers of Indians as officers, So we're familiar with the martial races that the army has always relied on, but now a new class is admitted and into the Indian army, and that's the middle class for the first time in Indian. And so all of these young men who I follow, but also thousands of others who would never have dreamt of having a part to play in the Indian military or in the armed services, suddenly were offered this glamorous and very sort of opportune and promising position as young officers. Position where a white man who is in the enlisted ranks would salute you. An unthinkable thing, in fact. But also a position that comes with a lot of confusion and with a lot of ambivalence, because even perhaps more so than a Jawan at that point, to be middle class is also to have a certain amount of education, a certain amount of relative amount of political awareness perhaps, and therefore that sort of, I believe probably made the moral confusion of being in that position, of fighting for the empire while your countrymen are fighting for freedom.
Did they leave behind notes, and what kind of reference did you have to?
So no, I didn't have and oddly enough I took on a very almost paradoxical challenge when I wrote this book, which is recovering the lives of a couple of young people whom were on the verge of completely disappearing from memory. They weren't just forgotten, they were almost sort of entirely forgotten. They weren't just hidden, that is. And B, the part of the nature of how they had been sort of erased from my family record is that even the letters and the artifacts, the things that would have belonged to them, had at various points in the past been sort of cleaned out of the lives of those who survived. So I didn't have a lot of letters. I did have a few letters to go by.
Why do you think they were cleaned out? Were people ashamed of this?
In the specific case, no. It's not a question of shame. But what I found, and in the book, when you encounter a hidden history and you try to write about it, part of what you end up writing is an account of why it was hidden. So my book is the question that runs throughout it is, why was this a war that needed to be forgotten by the country, and why were these young men who were enlisted in this war and were killed by it, why did they need to be forgotten by the family? And I think that there's a sort of confluence of different things, of guilt and shame, of political inconvenience, and the difficulty of fitting India's war into a period that we want defined by India's freedom movement, but also on a personal level of grief. And there's no taking that out of a story of the war, which is when someone dies, and especially when they die young. What do you do to carry the memory with you? And can that memory just be too heavy? And then do you choose to leave it behind?
Just to kind of add to what Raghu was saying, a lot of what he said is of course very, very true for Indian soldiers in the First World War as well, and the idea that they're so forgotten in a way, that history is so hidden, not only from the Indian side, because it's so it's almost a kind of, it's an encumbrance to remember this population who fought an imperial war at a time when you're talking about nationalism. How do you explain people signing up to fight an imperial war? But then on the British side as well, especially during, in the way in which the war, the kind of colonial contribution to the war is completely forgotten, is this whole guilt of empire. How do we actually talk about a war that we want to, kind of project as a good war, a just war? What do you make of having enlisted a large number of colonial people who have fought in that war? It opens up a whole number of very, very uncomfortable questions. So in the First World War, most of the soldiers, as Raghu rightly said, they weren't in the officer class. They were really, Jawans from very, very remote villages of India to fight, and there's no written record really. So the voices are very, very forgotten. And when it's not that so the theme hidden histories works quite well, because it's not that they're necessarily totally forgotten. It's you have to scratch quite a bit to start unearthing them. Quite often, once you start speaking to people who've served in the army, they'll very quickly tell you that, oh, my father fought in the Second World War and my grandfather fought in the First World War. And you can just quite often just military officers, and the Punjab is quite rich in still having a very rich military tradition, where you still have like a third or fourth generation person who's part of the army and who comes from a tradition of their grandfathers and fathers having served in the army. They will very quickly tell you about their family history, but then the family history is very different from the national history, and how you reconcile the two becomes quite interesting, because what they remember is very different from what you learn in history curriculums. And it reminds me almost one of my favorite Agha Shahid Ali poems, where he says, my memory comes in the way of your history and your history comes in the way of my memory. Those things don't, there's a huge disconnect between those two.
I should add that although what Vedica and I are saying sounds like very large abstractions about history and how it's constructed or undermined, they're actually very, what makes the story interesting is there's very particular and specific political events that make the history particularly sort of unpalatable. And one of them, I think, probably, I'm just throwing this out there, but I think, having just read Faisal Devri's book and talked to him about it, the Khilafat movement had to really, was Gandhi's reaction to the British plan to dissolve the caliphate after the Ottomans lost the First World War. And one of the points that Gandhi was really pressing in the Khilafat movement was that it was unconscionable for Britain to use Muslim soldiers to oppose the Ottomans, and then betray the cause of Islam in that way by dissolving the caliphate. And so, one very key and sort of probably quite excruciating fact about the deployment of Indian soldiers against the Ottoman armies was that it was Muslims fighting Muslims in this sort of like sort of sacred geography of Islam.
Just to add to that, also the ways in which we remember certain conflicts or certain periods in history kind of become very wedded to the national stories that we've kind of grown up with, and we forget the very global connections that exist at the time. The wars are a great example, but even more generally, the ways in which colonial rule opened up international connections is quite interesting, and those are very forgotten as well.
And very rich.
My question to you is, how important is the role of women in terms of collecting information when you're working on something on a history project?
So sorry, Reena, I can't answer that question, because it has nothing to do with the book that I'm talking about here. It's a very good question, but I'm not competent to answer it. The hidden history aspect of the book that I put together on the basis of what would be sort of 4 times the volume of this particular book left behind by my father, it's very appropriate that these young people, I was born in 1948, my father was born in 1916, so he would have been too young for your war, but not too young for your war. And when I came across in the 80s, the writings gathered together here are from the 80s, I realized that there was an extraordinary mine of reflection and information, that it was important when I got hold of this. My father himself was very resistant to having it published. He wanted to have the whole thing published, and he didn't want to have any selections made. And in a way, in a very real way, I made the selections for your generation and for people who. So it's extraordinarily comforting to know that you in your generation are looking at these collective memories, submerged, hidden, forgotten or whatever. Just to come back to the theme of belonging and voice that are the sort of underlying themes for this event. My father was born, he was the son of a renegade Punjabi Brahmin who became a Catholic. His mother's family were Sufis originally, they were Muslims. So he was brought up as a Catholic in this particular atmosphere of Punjab, Lahore, that area, and became a communist when he was about 18 years old, then joined the Indian civil service. But in a way, his voice was never found by being in the Indian civil service. His voice was found by writing a book or writing a series of narratives which were not what I did in the district, or what I told Nehru, or what I said to the minister, which is very often what civil servants do, but a book that was a real reflection on fairly central themes, including some of the themes that Ram Guha shared with us yesterday, and that was why he was brandishing the book, but also social and cultural history, so hidden histories of ordinary people and of an ordinary, let's say, his milieu. There were stories about his civil service milieu, of course, but the stories about his particular milieu are absolutely fascinating for anybody who reads this book. And if you'll allow me, Reena, I'd like to just read out a passage where he's talking about the Punjabi Christian milieu into which he was born and raised. He says the radical division into Catholic and fragmentation of the latter into denominations at all points of the religious spectrum accentuated the isolation of Christians. Sectarians were often less hostile to non-Christians than to each other. To my father, so this is a man who's been a convert from Hinduism, Protestants were heretics, almost worse than pagans, and the names of the great heresiarchs like Luther, Calvin, and Zwingli little better than those of Beelzebub. As a schoolboy, kicking a football about on the fine open space on Simla's Upper Mall, before World War I, virtually closed to Indians to avoid offense to the Kipling characters hacking about on whalers and bays, I used to be possessed of a fearful curiosity about what would happen if I went into the Anglican cathedral and half believed that I would be struck down by a thunderbolt from heaven. The Protestants gave as good as they got, typecasting Catholics in all the demonology of the Reformation and of Anglo-American Puritanism as idolaters of the Virgin and the saints. Each Christian denomination thus kept a great deal to itself, rather like a Hindu subcaste, but with much less a family and clan ritual, myth and legend. The Uttarids, and here he's talking about his maternal ancestors, were piously strict in their convert Catholicism, with obligatory Sunday Mass, frequent sacraments, and daily prayer. But there were no Protestant-type family prayers, and the Bible they must have done in their pre-Roman days had long been discontinued in deference to Catholic terror of private interpretation. There must have been a Bible in my grandfather's study, since he was for years engaged in translating a portion of it, but I never saw one in the rest of the house, nor in that of any relatives. What they had was approved prayer books and missals, interleaved with pictures of Christ, the Virgin, and the saints, done in a style that I came to regard as intolerably wishy-washy when I became an atheist at the ripe age of 14.
Yudhisthir, I'm sorry I have to cut you there. Raghu had quoted as having said, if you're lucky, you don't choose the story, but the story chooses you. What would you have to say?
Okay. If you're lucky, you don't choose the story, but the story chooses you. I'm not a storyteller, but I'm a shaper of narratives. I've done a lot of editing. I'm a sociologist and anthropologist, so the kinds of stories I tell are different. But inevitably, in my own work, in my own career, the sorts of books I put together, or the sorts of events or human situations that I've been led to analyze, have been exactly that. They have been events that have impacted so strongly on my sensibility, if you like, that I felt obliged to take them up. Just as here, this whole corpus of writings, it came to me. I didn't go looking for it. It came to me because my father was sharing his work with me. And once I went through the whole of it, it was quite clear that this was something I had to do something with.
The same thing essentially you're saying, it came to me and something. Would you also have had this experience? How did it come to you, the story?
Yeah, I think I feel very much the same way, and in a way, you know, it was a subject that I kind of stumbled upon, and it became interesting, and I was just collecting material, and after a while you kind of become captive to the story. It's almost like kind of Stockholm syndrome. You need to you're constantly thinking about these characters, what it must have been like, and you kind of just want to share it with other people. So at least I didn't write the book with any intention of actually having other people read it. It's great that other people have read it, but it was mostly just to get the story out and be done with it, to tell it and feel satisfied that I had actually explored it. I think, just from when I became interested in it to by the time that it finished, and the book was published, and I work a full-time job, it was about 4 years. But a lot of it was collecting materials. It's quite an image-heavy book as well. I think I mentioned that there isn't a lot of textual archive in that sense. So what I was aiming to do was put forward a lot of the photographic archive, which again is very, very interesting. Using the photographs to give the reader a sense of what it must have been like, what life must have been like. And there are some fabulous images of Indian soldiers. For example, in England, recuperating during the war, going on tours of London, going in these open-top buses on tours of London, or playing in the fields in France, having French children and playing games, in prisoner of war camps in Germany, for example. So in that sense, it was a long period of collation and so on.
Coming back to Raghu. You said, I've never flown in a two-seater plane, let alone fly one. I've never set up an explosive device, or been a doctor in war, or known about life in the army. How then did you describe all this? What kind of research did you put in?
Actually, this connects very much to the question that you put to Yudhisthir, which I would like to answer because it has a great bearing on my book. So, as I said earlier, I didn't have letters. I didn't receive the papers of any of the characters that I was writing about, and there was no they weren't public figures in any respect. So the main to write the personal stories that I wanted to that I needed to, I relied very much on a sort of oral archive of people from that generation who were still around, and the difficulty of finding that oral archive suddenly opened my eyes to something about the role that women primarily play in sustaining memory and in sustaining history, which I had never thought about before, because all my life my mother has been inviting me to come with her to visit elderly relatives in a hospital, or to know who a particular a grand uncle is, and I've been totally gloriously dismissive of this because I didn't care. Right, like a teenager, except it lasted much longer than just my teenage years. It was my privilege to not know or care or keep in touch with older people in my community, in my family, or in my society. Whereas she's a marvel of doing this, and makes a very strong point of being in touch with such people. Now, when I came upon this story and I realized that I needed to learn about the lives and the personalities and the experiences of young people who are all dead through their contemporaries who are alive, I realized I didn't know who any of them were. And so immediately I was tugging on my mother's sleeve saying, can we go and visit all of those people whose names I don't know, who I can't connect to on a family tree myself, but for whom you somehow, and in short, I ended up through almost entirely women in my family finding connections to older people in their 80s and their 90s, and those people I found had held these invaluable, like these little treasures of story for me, as though they'd held them in trust. And I realized something, which is that the business of remembering is treated as being an extremely private or individualistic act. But
did they share willingly with you, or did you kind of?
Absolutely, that's a whole other thing. The experience of talking to people at the end of their lives about the periods in their lives when they were youngest and healthiest and the best years of their lives. In short, it was a very poignant experience. But the point I'm trying to make is that we think of memory, especially in the context of writing and of art. We think of memory as being this very individualistic act, but it's not. I discovered that it's really a social act, a familial act, a kind of labor because it takes effort, and in fact a kind of work done entirely by women. And suddenly I was so grateful for it.
Back to my question about flying an airplane and setting up an explosive device. How did you describe that?
Right. So once I had sort of climbed up my mother's family tree to find various elderly relatives, what I was doing was I was looking for either veterans of the Second World War, most of whom didn't know the family but had known the war and could give me could answer my questions and share some insights about what those experiences might have been like, as well as the larger sort of existential questions about what it meant to be in that position, and also civilians who are still alive who may not have known the war but they knew the family. It's not the hardest thing, in fact, to get an account of what it's like to fly a two-seater military aircraft.
When you haven't flown one?
Yeah, because a lot of people have written about it, like a lot. And the experience of flying a Hawker Hurricane is, I would wager, more or less the same whether you are a brown guy or a white guy, and a lot of white guys have written about it as well. So there's no shortage of, there's no particular shortage of source material about these more glamorous military aspects of the experience of the war. But the more sensitive and the more delicate things that I was trying to excavate had to do with family memory and had to do with the emotional experiences of the war, and to some extent maybe the moral experiences of the war, and that was the greater challenge.
I just wanted to add to what Raghu said earlier, the ways in which you kind of use family history, and this kind of ties back to your book as well. When I was researching my book, I spent a lot of time at the Imperial War Museum in London, and they have an amazing collection of oral archives where they've actually just sent researchers to go and record the memories and memoirs in kind of interview form of veterans of war. And one of the things that that struck me while I was writing my book is just how bad we are as a country in terms of actually speaking to an older generation and recording their views. I had a session with young school kids this morning, and I said, when you study a particular event, do you ask your parents or your grandparents whether they lived through it and what it was like? And all of them nodded their head and said no. And I think that again is a very cultural thing. We never ask what it was like. What were you doing on the eve of independence? For example, did you celebrate? Did you not celebrate? What did you do? We just don't ask those questions. We kind of tend to think of history as these events, these dates, but not think of it as something we ourselves have lived through or shaped in any way and form. And I think that's why books like that, those memoirs are really.
How easy or difficult was it to get your father talking about, top areas that were not really comfortable, or were there any such areas?
It was very easy to get him. Thank you. It's very easy to get him writing because he wrote literally thousands of pages, and so it wasn't a question of conversing with him. This text is entirely his text, only maybe cut, edited a little bit by me. But just coming back to your point about memory, Susan Sontag once famously wrote that there's no such thing as collective memory, there is a stipulation that what happens in society is that certain events are chosen at a particular moment in time, and then having been selected, they are then organized, marshaled, classified into a corpus, which then becomes referred to as the collective memory. And the forgetting is not a non-remembering, it's a way of remembering otherwise, and that's happening all the time. Now, what's interesting with their books, which is the work, they are working as historians. In this book, which is my father's work, he was a trained historian, he studied history, but he was sifting through all the time what was on the one hand sort of collective memory, family law, and this kind of thing, and on the other, the sort of evidence that he could get from research, from reading, from what daily life and his own life judgment and experience brought him. And the key thing, I'll just return to that, the key thing that's valuable about this book is that although the publisher has put on the cover a photograph of Nehru and Shastri, which is why yesterday Ram Guha refers to it as a book called Nehru and Shastri, the Nehru and Shastri part is very minor. What's much more important is cultural and social history about how people operated in these confined milieux where there is very little evidence. Historians have not so far been interested in it, and that's where the originality of this work lies. And I just want to close by saying that unfortunately with the bookshop didn't work, so there are no copies available for sale, but should there be anybody interested, I have a few copies available for sale.
Thank you so much for a wonderful session. I'm sorry, this is typical that kind of session that could have continued for much longer. Would you mind turning your mics off? But thank you so much for a sensational session. Unfortunately not, because we all have to get into a bus to head to the Museum of Goa and there's a book launch outside. But thank you so much, Reena, Vedica, Raghu and Raj for a super session. Two quick notes. There will be a book launch now of a very special book in the context of Goan history called Catholic Orientalism. Also, anyone interested in taking the delegate bus from the International Center to the Museum of Goa for tonight's beautiful poetry reading should please be ready by around 6:15, 6:20 at the reception. Thank you so much for this panel. Please join us outside. I urge you to buy all these wonderful books. As you heard, Vedica's and Raghu's and Reena's are all on sale in the bookshop, and Raj is available with him. Thank you.